Good afternoon. We are joined today by Mr. Rajat M Nag, whose book co-authored with Mr. Kohli. We are here to discuss today. This is part of Sensemaker. Sensemaker are Asia conversations where we have serious conversations, academic conversations, but of a quality that are not too serious. So with that, I would like to welcome you to Sensemaker, sir.
Thank you.
And with your permission, can we start with our conversation?
Sure, please.
Before we do, I would like to introduce our guest, member of the board, and a very senior and distinguished academician, Mr. Rajat M Nag. The very, very brief bio, because how do you put together a short profile of a life lived in so many places at so many points? Mr. Nag was born in Sylhet, which is now in Bangladesh. That point of time known as East Pakistan. He graduated from IIT, so one of the original IITs, and then moved to Canada for a master's in engineering degree.
That's right.
From doing a master's in engineering degree, slowly and steadily you moved to finance. You moved to investment finance. And perhaps that got into you an attractiveness to study economics as a complicated subject as it is, which I most welcome because engineers are aplenty, economists are few. That made you move to the London School of Economics and Political Science, where you studied under Amartya Sen, later Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. You studied economics, and from there, slowly and steadily, you gave up a career in finance to focus on international development. You started your career with an international development consultancy, which saw you move back to Asia, slightly below India in terms of geography of Indonesia. And from there, slowly and steadily, having served as the chief economist of that particular organization, you saw yourself move to the multilateral organization known as the Asian Development Bank. From the Asian Development Bank, you started off as a project economist, if I'm not wrong.
Right.
And finally, pinnacled your career, if I were to put it like that, as the Managing Director General. A very interesting word, because Managing Directors are aplenty, Director Generals are aplenty, but Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank, where you started your stint as the Managing Director General with a small thing they called the global financial crisis.
It's immediately thereafter.
Yes. So this conversation is born from that particular long experience and exposure to international events. So I welcome you. This book
Thank you very much.
Is a timely book, but more than that, this book must have benefited from this long sort of career that you've had.
Right.
So I welcome you formally.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
With your permission, now I would like to open it.
Please.
So there are many aspects to the book, but one of the most fascinating aspects to the book is the core.
Right.
So you also serve as a distinguished fellow of Emerging Markets Forum, of which Mr. Kohli is the founder and director, even now.
Right.
But the Emerging Markets Forum is based in a very interesting building called the Watergate Building in Washington, D.C. And you, as we are very lucky to have you here, in Gurugram. It's quite an international book.
Right.
How did this, the idea for the book, the conceptualization for the book, considering that two people so far apart in geography were writing it?
Right.
And although I'm pretty sure that both of you would agree largely, but let's say you had a disagreement.
Right.
So how did you manage to kind of converge to a point?
Well, all of this helps to have a very good friend as your co-author. So that was, I think, one very important element. Of course, Harinder is based in Washington. I was based here. But given the connectivity issues, talking to him, time difference was a challenge.
Right.
Either he imposed on my time or I imposed on his. That worked out well. But of course, we also met frequently because we started conceptualizing the book in the pre-COVID days. But interestingly, wrote it during the COVID days, and that was probably good in a way because we had all the time in the world to sort of focus on it. We met if we had to, but otherwise mostly in writing or on the phone. He worked at the World Bank, so he has also a very similar. He's an engineer and then sort of moved into MBA, did his MBA from Harvard. So we have the same background in a way. We have the same predisposition towards development. I was with the ADB, he was with the World Bank. But of course, we have different views about things. And that is where I think friendship comes in very handy. We had very intense discussions and we disagreed on some of the nuances. But it was also very enjoyable because I had the feeling, and I'm sure he did too, that if you couldn't convince your co-author, how on earth would you convince anybody else? And at the end, really, it was a joint product in the truest sense of the word. That we agreed literally on every comma and the emphasis. And we're very proud of this book. You'll have to judge on a larger scale. Very proud that we could get it out, put on paper, that was on our mind. And that's what basically this is about governance.
Right.
But, nowadays, we don't have to argue anymore about why good governance. I mean, there's been enough said. Good governance is good development. Good governance is basically what you need for a society to function. The question is not why, but how. And this question was actually raised to me by a very senior minister in one country that I was visiting, because usually people from MDBs give long sermons on governance, and I did the same. I talked about good governance, and at the end of it, she very politely said, "Mr. Nag, I agree with everything you said. Now, how do I do with this?" And that question really gnawed at me ever since, because I think I didn't give a very good answer. So this question that we have been dealing with, and this answer that we hope we provide to some extent, was the genesis of how do you achieve good governance? Not why do you need good governance? And we can talk more about it. Institutions comes in, but that was the basic sort of rationale.
But I would try to put in bracket question in the middle. So institutions are important, and you kind of laid the context of being part of an MDB and going to countries. But the book, it comes in a pivotal moment. I mean, the book must have taken some time. I'm presuming the conversation started in 2019, and the book came out in our hands last month,
right.
In September, where it was released in Marrakesh. From 2019, when the world was a very sunny place, stock markets were going up, everybody was hopeful about the future. Today, while we discuss this, in October 2023, we have 2 wars going on. Institutions could not have mattered more at any point of time in history. And yet, when we ask people to define institutions,
right,
formal and informal, there is a wide variety of opinions, evidence, so on and so forth. So, has the context of the book changed now?
No, that's a very relevant point. What I found was a book like this always feels more relevant today than yesterday. So today, of course, because of the challenges you're mentioning, but everybody is concerned about good governance, and the way to achieve good governance is good institutions. Then the immediate Socratic question, how do you achieve good institutions? And that's where the issues that you raise come in. I think it's important to distinguish between institutions and organizations. I think that's part of the confusion. Institutions are rules of the game. How does a society decide how it will survive? What will be the rules of engagement of society? And what will be the consequences if you don't follow those rules? In a way, it's like the soccer game. What are the rules of the game, and what would be a goal, what would not be a goal, offside, etc. But what we then found, and there's a lot of work done over the last some decades, that institutions really are of two kinds. Formal, those are the constitutions, the sort of rules and laws that are laid out. Not easy, but relatively easy, because then the question is implementing those rules and laws. Those constitutions should be upheld. So why do the same rules work in one country, doesn't work in another? That's where the informal institution comes in. That's where the whole aspect of behavioral economics comes in. So what we found was that over the last 7-8 decades, most countries now have formal institutions in place. When I started, life was relatively easy because you could go and say, you need an auditor general's office. You need to, have some written rules and on land reclamation, for example. Those are now all there. Most of the countries now have very well-written laws, very well-written rules, maybe also have constitutions. But the outcome is very different. And the outcome is different because of the informal institutions, which are norms and beliefs and conventions and social sort of interactions. And that's why the study of institutions over the last several decades has moved from just talking about the rules of the game, but really to what is now essentially called behavioral economics. And that's why it's so important. And as you know, several Nobel Prizes have now been won by behavioral economists. And I think, in this book, we try to really draw on the behavioral economics to see how we can strengthen the informal institution, because that, I think, makes the difference.
Right. So essentially you're saying that from the model of the rational man to the model of the irrational man, it completed an entire circle, a life cycle of institutions, as it were.
Right.
That brings me to the title of the book.
Right.
From Here to Denmark.
Right.
I'm presuming you're not quoting Shakespeare. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark.
Well, partly. As a matter of fact, I do use that quote somewhere in the book.
Yes.
I'll tell you why and how it happened. When OUP talked to us about this book and write this book, one of the first things they said, which is the right thing, is to say we must think of a book title, because otherwise book like saying institutions, people will, okay, fine, good, forget it. So it was very instinctive. And since I was sitting in Delhi, my immediate thing was Denmark, as you all know, is sort of taken to be the standard of good government. This is Denmark, the country. But there's also Denmark, the mythical place, where there's good governance, justice prevails, people are free, the quality of life is good, incomes are high, all that. So it's not Denmark, the country, but Denmark, in that sense, the standard idea. And I just sort of... Sorry?
A mental model.
Mental model. So almost instinctively, I don't know why it bumped, and it just came out of my mouth. I said, from Delhi to Denmark. Now, I didn't mean Delhi as again Delhi, because then I actually thought about it. Then I said, I'll get caught up in the debate about why Delhi and not Djibouti or Dhaka or Dakar. So again, instinctively, we said, from here to Denmark. Denmark is that mythical place. Here is where there is sort of in lack of good governance, lack of justice, etc.
Problems of governance.
Interestingly, when this book was published, to my great horror, I found it was listed on the travel section on some sites. So anyways.
That is not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing. Maybe there'll be more readers for that than otherwise. But the subtitle of the book, The Institution, Critical Importance of Institutions for Good Governance, comes in.
So this, while reading the book, and the book is deeply informative, the book also is extremely analytical. But one particular thing, because you just stressed the importance of mental model. In the book, the model of good governance, the black box, if you will, there is an entire section where you refer to different places. For example, there's a very interesting history of how Japan came to be, or how Denmark, England, they managed the institutional problems and bridged them. But the tract on politics, the mental model that comes up time in and time out, is very Indic, if you will, which makes sense, and there is nothing wrong with it. But is it also not true that scholars of development, of global growth, have been, tasked with looking at it from much broader perspective? So when you now take a 30,000-foot view, uh, are there other mental models that could better capture the story of global growth that is currently not being told institutionally or non-institutionally?
Let me step back a bit. As I said, as you said, I worked at the ADB for long 27 years. World Bank, ADB, all the multilateral agencies, they start off by saying we're apolitical. Okay. Now, apolitical as an institution is fine, but politics is what matters. So you cannot divorce politics, because ultimately the whole issue of informal institutions arises from the fact that in society there is a power asymmetry. Some people are more powerful than others. So politics matters. So how does this negotiation of power balance happen? Why does the poor landed peasant, landless peasant, not have the freedom? Is because the landlord has the economic power, the political power. And we know that it is a question of that negotiation. And I think you mentioned in our conversation about the patron-client relationship, etc. So politics matters. Now, if you assume politics away, then obviously you're shrinking your space. The other thing which we have done in economics for a long time, in development economics, is also thought it to be institution neutral, because human behavior is very complex. So economists assumed, at least let the law of large number prevail. So you will think this way, I'll think this way, she'll think the other way, and they'll cancel out. And therefore, the epitome of this rational person who is omniscient, omnipotent, and I think Richard Thaler, in one of his sort of quips, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, but also tremendous sense of humor. He said basically what economists assumed was that you can think like Albert Einstein, and you have the mental capacity, storage capacity of IBM 350. Those times IBM 350 was the epitome. And the willpower of Mahatma Gandhi, i.e. ideal person doesn't exist. So it's not that the real person is irrational, but we are a contradiction. That is where behavioral economics comes in. So you can't ignore politics, you can't ignore behavioral economics. And I think what you are referring to or asking, Amogh, which is very relevant, our models need to encompass this. These are difficult. How do you encompass the political? How do you encompass the behavioral aspects? And a third element, which I think we are not doing enough of, is the whole concept of freedom and justice. And this is where Amartya Sen's work comes in.
Absolutely.
Development as freedom. And he basically says development ultimately is about the sense of freedom that I enjoy. It's not about the fact that I eat and I have clothes to wear. That is a necessary condition. But ultimately the freedom is, or development is, when I feel free. Gender empowerment. How do you break out of that centuries-old gender biases? So I think very much a work in progress. And our book is certainly not the last word, not even the first word. It's a very small contribution. But what we've tried to do is bring in those aspects of politics, of justice, of behavioral economics. Is therefore much more complex than just sort of having the right law and think that it would be a black box which should work.
So more like weaving a tapestry.
Weaving a tapestry, and each is, because it's a handmade tapestry, each is going to be very different.
And divergent.
And divergent, exactly.
That brings me to a very interesting discussion that we were having just before we started this. In all of this, and one of the overarching themes of the book is the diversity of institutions.
Right.
And you do a wonderful assessment of looking at them, perhaps because of your training now as away from academic economics and actual implementation economics. You look at it from the country level, But then you also go down to the level of traffic in Gurugram and Delhi, right? Which is incredible. I think that is, dissertations have to be written on that. All of this kind of brings one very unsaid rule or unsaid actor in the book, the informal institutions.
Right.
And these informal institutions are rapidly changing. They're not, because they don't need a writ of the parliament, they can come up. What was cool yesterday is no longer today.
Right.
And how do economists, how do public policy guys, policy wonks as they call themselves, multilateral institutions kind of try keeping a situation or a pulse on this rapidly changing landscape?
Right. Well, it's certainly very, very challenging. Let me make 3 points on this, Amogh. One is we realized in the course of writing this book and also in our own experience, there's nothing as a one size fits all. Okay, so you cannot transplant best practices. There's nothing as a best practice because what works in the US will not work here in India. And the same laws, same rules and regulation. And what struck me, and you mentioned Gurugram, was outside my house, there's a 3-way traffic stop. And every morning there's a chaos. And of course, the first reaction was, all that they need to do is put the stop sign. There is a stop sign, like octagonal, they should probably put a police person. But there is one, excepting he's in a corner. Then why do we all get into that crossing? And then, of course, there's a gridlock. And in my very first few days of back, I sort of said, I'll just wait at this stop sign. And my driver said, sir, chaliye. I said, no, we have to stop, because I was sort of, And of course, he then said, then you'll be stopped here for the whole day. And then I found people honking at me, etc., etc. So I then went in, and of course, people were shouting various expletives at me, etc. A few days later, very coincidental, I was in Washington, Harinder's place. Same situation. Three-way stop sign. Everybody stops, goes, everybody stops. And then, totally sort of, coincidentally, I was reading a book on behavioral economics and my good friend Kaushik Basu's book on Republic of Beliefs. Right. And it struck me what it really is about, beliefs. In Gurgaon, everybody believes that the other won't stop. And therefore, he or she goes in. By the way, she's are no better than the he's. As a matter of fact, sometimes I find them to be more sort of, demanding.
Such cases. We have people here who
but in the US, same laws. So it is not a question of do we have the right laws in Gurgaon? Yes. Do we have the stop sign? Yes. But people do not believe that others will stop. In Washington, they do. So then, it really opened up for me a whole slew of things. How do you change beliefs? Now, that is a very small example to say, but that to me is very telling. So this is where informal institutions, the changes of beliefs and norms and conventions comes in. And to do that is not easy because it's a part of history and culture. You need education. You need education. Now, that does not mean with education it will happen, because I'm sure many of the Gurgaon drivers who do this also are educated, but it's the beginning of that process of human agency that I'm talking about. Sorry about this. You'll have to edit this out.
No, that will do. But I think this might be an important comment.
No.
So, but in the book, you make a very interesting distinction between education and human capital.
Right.
And if we were to take a step back and look at the broad convergence about the importance of human capital. I mean, Amartya Sen, he got a Nobel Prize for his work on democracy and how those democratic institutions then feed into institutions, and those institutions then take you up with you. The experience in the world's largest and the youngest continent, which has now been taken at least the youngest bit has been taken over by Africa. Asia has been slightly different. And while I was reading the book, and this was a question that kept on popping up, do we actually really need institutions, or Mao Zedong and company had it right? You just herd people towards some great goal and you'll be there. Because you look at Korea, although Korea doesn't really feature in the book in that particular way.
Republic of Korea.
Republic of Korea.
Yeah, but you're talking about the Democratic Republic, North
Yes.
Korea. You're talking about North
I'm talking about the experience of
Right.
both the Koreas
Right.
taken together.
Right.
Japan,
Right.
Japan does in a very big way. China, Singapore, the pre-part of your career, the
Right.
Asian financial crisis
Right.
countries, they had institutions which were very sticky. Let's put it like that.
Right.
Because most of them were either dictatorships or partial dictatorships. And they fulfilled the promise of development.
Right.
And this is a big debate in economics going back.
Right.
Do economies do better under dictatorships?
Right.
Or let's put it politically correctly, do they do better in partially free terms
Right.
rather than fully free? And the book takes a very strong position on it, that institutions, no matter what, it is not just democracy that defines an institution. Institutions, no matter what, are important in progress, growth, human capability, human development. But does that remain true across the spectrum globally?
Mhm.
Or do you think that there is a certain amount of flux in this that we still need to factor?
Right. Well, you packed a lot of issues
Sorry.
in one. No, that's extremely important. You've packed it very well. But let me unpack and answer it sort of in parts. First of all, whether it's China or whether it's country A or country B or North Korea or anyone, each country has institutions. They have rules of the game. Now, the rules may be different.
Yeah.
They may be played differently, but they all have institutions. So that's one, just to sort of, so nothing is institution free. It cannot be. Human beings, right from the caveman time, must have had some institutions about rules of how they'll interact with each other. Now, the question is, what is the role of the state? I think what you're really saying is the stickiness. You're really referring to the stickiness of the state as the module central point, predominant central
As a
point.
clearinghouse of development.
As a right. Now, what we find looking at history, that's how we looked at 6 countries spread over geography, spread over space and all of that, that in each case, fundamentally, the issues are 2. One is development of human agency, which is basically building human capital, which is education and health. You have to be literate and skilled enough to participate in the development process and benefit from it, not be active recipients of it. That's one. So education. And the other is health. You've got to be well enough to work, to study, to do your things and to participate. So human capital, including, which is basically education and health, are very important. But the other element which is very important, and that is what we saw whether it was Denmark or Britain through the process of glorious revolution, starting with the Magna Carta way back in 1215, Japan, Korea, whatever, countries in Africa or Asia, Botswana is empowerment. That is ultimately we individuals, the human spirit probably by its very nature wants to sing and sing freedom. Now that is what we have called empowerment. Empowerment of being empowered to participate in the decision-making process which affects us. Now, there are various political arrangements which enables that empowerment to be top-down, which is then the state that you're talking about, or bottoms-up, which is a democracy. So I'm taking those two sort of extreme ends. Now, again, I strongly believe in evidence. So we say, okay, what does the evidence say? Now, as you know, in this book, we've talked about we took 20 countries around the world and saw what they were doing on the Human Development Index, what they were doing on the per capita income, what they were doing on the governance indicators, and all of them, the countries which do well on HDIs and also do well on governance all of them are democracies. Now, first of all, I'm not a political scientist, so therefore I don't know enough to be able to debate the merits or demerits. But one thing is very clear is that empowerment is key. People have to be able to participate, and evidence shows that the advanced countries, not just economically, but in terms of either a sense of freedom, a sense of social well-being, are democracies. Now, that does not mean that the other political arrangements are invalid. What we also find that the same political arrangement is probably not suitable at each stage of development. In the early stages of development, there is now evidence to show that probably a greater element of control, state control as it were, is probably helpful. But just like a pressure cooker, you have to release the pressure as you go. Because you know that famous Maslow's need hierarchy model. First, I'm very concerned about my clothing and my food, and I don't really care who is ruling me. But then as my needs get filled, I come to the pinnacle where I want self-fulfillment. And the self-fulfillment, by definition, cannot be imposed from somebody from there. So I think this is a part of human nature, and doesn't matter where that human being happens to be. So that's a point that I want to put on the table, Amogh. What we also then found is the concept of what we call the three travelers. And, the various names for it, Raghuram Rajan called them pillars, whatever. So that is, a society principally survives on three institutions. One is the state. No question, you can't get away from the state, otherwise there will be total chaos.
Right.
You also need markets. Now again, you don't have to go necessarily all the way to Milton Friedman's free market total with adequate, sort of rules and regulations, and the community, which is really the people. So it is these three travelers who have to be in balance. Now, that does not mean they'll always be equally. The state will have to dominate in some areas, like defense, for example. We actually don't want anybody else to be involved in defense. So, by definition, the state must have what is called the monopoly over violence. So, the markets will have a greater say in the individual decisions about consumption and production. Community will have greater say in basically what's best for them. So that is where you have the concepts of decentralization, inclusive localism, whatever. And the concept is these three must stay in balance. They must be like three travelers walking in tandem to go from here to Denmark. And if one is falling behind, then the journey sort of, breaks down. So I am an unabashed proponent of empowerment. And evidence tells me, it is not a political bias, evidence tells me that democracy is the one which provides that. And history, at the beginning of, well back into Panini's time and Kautilya's time, they talked about consultation with, people. And in ancient Greece, there was a talk about, involving the local communities. But throughout history, it has been slow but gradual involvement of community. But in the last 2 centuries, there has been a complete sort of, exponential growth of democracies. I have to go through the figures, but broadly, in the beginning of the 19th century, less than 4% of the world were sort of so-called, democracies. By now, it's, 83% of people live in democracies, not perfect by any means, and only about 17%, 15 to 17%, what I would call democracies. So the trend is there, imperfect. As a matter of fact, I'm concerned about the backsliding in democracies in many places. But if you look at the arc of history, it does tend towards Denmark. as we say towards the end of the book. And of course, we quote Tagore quite freely.
Yes.
And where is this whole thing about where the mind is free and the head is held high? So to us, development is ultimately, following Amogh Rai's logic, is about freedom and justice. It is not only about having enough to eat and enough to sort of, incomes, which is important, necessary condition, but not sufficient. And we believe that ultimately it is the empowerment, i.e. freedom. And that freedom, I think, is ensured better, not perfectly, by democracies. But again, having said all of this, I can't argue too strongly because I'm not a political scientist. So I'm begging away from that question in a sense.
But if I were to paraphrase it, the entire argument, you would say that democracies are taking a bullock cart instead of a conqueror. They're taking their time getting there.
I think it's probably in spurts. I mean, you're right. The bullock cart, example, metaphor would not be too inappropriate, say, for the last sort of, till the end of the 18th century.
Right.
But then the last, 2 centuries, things have galloped. As a matter of fact, in 1945, most of Asian and African countries were under colonial power. And then, boom, in 15 years, many of them became free, imperfectly. And then, in Latin America, around the same time, most were dictatorships, military dictatorships, or tyrants. Again, imperfect transition to democracy.
But
so I'm very hopeful. I mean, again, I think anybody in the development business is by nature an optimist. So I'm almost naively optimistic, but I feel very positive that we are in the right track at different speeds.
And this kind of brings me to a very interesting, and at this point of time, I'm largely relying on memory.
Right.
So I would seek your pardon for not quoting page numbers.
I'm very impressed with what you have done so far.
But one of the things is that towards the end of the book, you quote, so this book is interesting for me because it has one of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore.
Right.
But it is also one of my favorite philosophers, Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
Had a very nice quip about life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Right, exactly.
And for the last 50 years, it would appear that we have made him ridiculous. Thomas Hobbes was to be consigned to the dustbin of history, if you will, although it is impossible to do it. But he's made a comeback now, hasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Internecine conflict. While this book was going the editorial process, Russians decided it was a good time to get Ukraine back by force. And then Hamas decided in its infinite wisdom that it wanted to settle Gaza by 5,000 rockets. And now the Israelis are trying to get into Hamas Strip, which is, none of it has ever ended well. In all of this, and so this is very important from your perspective of being in not just one multilateral institution, but ADB, the World Bank, Emerging Markets Forum, self-help groups in India, and so on and so forth, but also Mr. Kohli. The challenge is institutions. Nationally, they might be strengthened, but international institutions, the institutions that countries looked up to, the United Nations, for one, ADB to a certain extent, AIIB, they are becoming much more politicized, and they are becoming. So if today ADB were to, let's not name any Organization X, and this is not Twitter, were to release a report, which a large country does not like. And so certainly the country is going to be like, you know what, we don't agree with this. This is absolutely wrong. This is biased XYZ. And countries have done this in the past. One strand of the book says, let there be light. The other strand, and the realist strand, says that perhaps we are overreaching. How do we conflate the two. Institutions are becoming stronger, but stronger institutions means that we don't have to take anything from outside.
Right.
And in the end, that's not going to
I think that's a very, very good question, and something that, since I was with the multilateral bank, struggled and still do. I think on the international institutions, on the global governance, they have certainly not lived up to the expectations. In a way, paradoxically, I say, therefore, they're even more relevant. There's more work to do, rather than saying they're irrelevant, therefore throw them to the dustbin of history. If you were to replace or remove the United Nations, you'll have to find the United Nations. If you want to remove some of these multilateral organizations, you've got to replace them with something. And that something is essentially a better international governance. I think some of the governance structures which came about at the end of the Second World War is obviously outdated. The Security Council structure, for example, or the governance structure in some of the multilaterals. And this is why, as you know, as part of India's G20 presidency, there has been a very, very interesting and important report written on the reforms of the multilateral system. But if I talk about in a larger context, the world is now more interconnected than it ever has been. Not only because of supply chains, but just because of the ease of movement of people. I mean, people travel, people go, people study here, work there. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So while the national institutions obviously have to be strengthened, and our book really has focused on national institutions, there is no doubt that the multilateral institutions and organizations are critically important. WTO, for example, I know it has not worked very well, but WTO, under this pressure against globalization, is now even more important. Now, globalization, I know, has its distractors, but the fact is because of globalization that the world's economies have all done well, and people are better off today than they were 2 or 3 decades back because of this international trade that has happened. And people have been able to trade across the seas and across the lands. So in terms of the international governance, I would say that because ultimately it comes into conflict with the so-called concept of sovereign state, which is you're talking about. That's something that I think the countries will have to resolve over time. And the global architecture of institutions will have to change. A country like India, for example, will have to have much more voice, say, in the United Nations, i.e. a Security Council seat. India is now the most populous country in the world. So you can't sort of say, it will have to be treated at the same level as any other country, but with a veto power. But that's work in progress. And that's actually a very difficult work in progress. But this book very, very much focuses on the national levels, because the international architecture is a very different set of issues, which we actually in this book don't get into at all.
Is that part 2 of the book?
First, let me get over the part 1.
But this kind of then one particular problem of institutions. And I believe in them. I believe that institutions are the most important and vital glue holding democracies or polyarchies together. But the problem is that institutions in and of themselves are extremely expensive to run. So when we say, let's have these institutional mechanisms, to give you just one, everything is getting expensive. To make policy, you need to know the number of people. Census is a costly affair. Institutionally, registration of birth, so on and so forth, is a costly affair. Getting people to health and school and college, all of these are costly affairs. Where is the money going to come from? Because there is this interesting thing that happened in the last 50 years, which is called lobbying. So you see corporate taxes drying up. The numbers are coming down. And you make an interesting point whenever you talk about, in the book, whenever you talk about the GDP, you're also saying that GDP might not be the be all end all yardstick that you've taken.
Welfare.
But we see large GDP countries not having enough money to run institutions that have been run for the last 600, 700, 800 years. So how do we fund institutions? How do we get citizens to participate in institutions much more actively?
Right. I think everything that you're saying really refers more to the state, one of the travelers in this. And that's the point that we make, is that the state must be powerful enough to be able to restrict violence, provide security, assure freedom, all of that. But the state should not become the feared leviathan, to quote Hobbes. And the state really needs to be what we say in the book, borrowing from Amogh Rai and Johnson, shackle leviathan. That is, the leviathan is very important, but also it must have bounds put on it. Otherwise, it will become the fearsome despot. So the important thing is not that all the things that you have said don't need to be done, but it's a question of who will do and what. And in the book, we talk about the state must first of all have credibility. And if you cannot have credibility if you don't match the requirement or the mandate you take on and the capability and the resources. So yes, defense obviously a matter of for the state. Foreign affairs, yes, but each state will have to decide how far down the ladder it would go. And this is where the other two partners come in. The state should not think that it will decide what it will do and give the crumbs to the other two partners. It really has to be balanced. Leave it to the market to do things about everything about production and consumption, excepting for the laws to be decided by the state. Leave it to the communities to decide what's going to happen in the community level. Don't sort of sit in a capital city to decide that. So, yes, your point is very well taken about resources, but I think it's a question of priorities. Why don't people pay taxes? Again, in this book we talk about, part of it is people don't pay taxes because they don't think the other person is paying taxes. Okay, there's obviously the question of enforcement. But in the UK, they found, again, UK was one of the first countries which actually established a group called the Behavioral Insights, and they've applied that in various things, including in tax collection. What it showed was, you used to get pamphlets, pay your taxes by April 30th, pay taxes. Nobody cared. Nobody cared, not because they didn't know that they had to pay by April 30th, not they didn't know that, paying taxes is important, but they didn't pay because they don't think others were paying. So what this BIT group did, started sending out a letter with technology it could be done, saying, dear so-and-so resident of, so-and-so, 85% of your neighbors have paid their taxes already. Would you not want to sort of do your own bit? And immediately it went up because it's, really? 85% have paid. Oh, okay, sorry. So now that may or may not work, and maybe some they'll say, good, if 85% have been suckers and have paid, good, I don't have to pay. But it doesn't work that way. There's people always want to be part of the Joneses or Smiths or whatever you call it. So I think that the issues that you raise are very important, but that should neither be a reason nor an excuse for not doing some of the things that the state must do and not do some of the things that it need not do. And therefore, the whole thing, I think you and I were talking about the PPP model, bringing the private sector, even for tax collection, you don't have to always do it by the state. I mean, you can outsource it, so long as there are enough guardrails built into it. And let the community be empowered. I keep saying empowerment, and I mean it in a very fundamental sense of give them the resources, then hold them accountable. And this is why I bring in the issue of empowerment, particularly at the community level. But of course, to empower, you have to have the human capital, therefore the importance of education, health, and the whole essence of, justice and freedom will have to come in. So it's, in a sense, a very complex process of beliefs, if you come to think of it. State just doing more is not the answer.
State doing more within restraints and getting other people to do it
Mhm.
is what you are
Right.
proposing as a
Right.
solution. So that as in this book there is an entire section devoted to an area that I absolutely love and hate. That is behavioral economics.
Right.
Because I straddle health economics and for the last 2.5 years behavioral economics.
Right.
A lot of these studies, I have my young colleague here, and just to give you an example, something happened in Europe, which was then taken over in Japan,
Right.
and then it was taken over in China, and then somebody went to China, saw it happening in China, came back, and because that somebody in question was a rich person, so he could have that particular thing run through, and it is very interesting. A lot of accidents happen, road accidents happen in India on highways, where people are trying to cross from one end of the highway to another. So in Gujarat, they did this interesting experiment. They got two artists, a mother and a daughter, to design a 3D zebra crossing.
Right.
And this 3D zebra crossing, while you were driving on this particular highway, from a distance you could see that, it's a visual, it's an ocular
Right.
trick.
Looks like a roadblock.
It looks like a roadblock. So you slow down. And this is where a school was, and kids used to cross it. Good. I asked my young colleague Farheen to look at, because one of the problems in India, and BIU, by the way, operates in India now. Behavioral Intelligence Unit has an office.
Oh, they do. Oh, I see.
They have an office in India. Ashoka University has CSPC, Center for Social and Behavioral
Right.
Change.
Right.
A lot of these, Niti Aayog,
Uh-huh.
the country's premier think tank,
Right.
has a behavior unit.
Right.
But I've always been interested, because in health economics, what we teach you is when facts start decaying.
Mhm.
Right? So I was interested in, it's been 10 years. Where are these 3D zebra crossings? Because in 2015-16, when this was announced, Delhi wanted to put one up, Gurugram wanted to put one up, Ahmedabad had put one up, Bengaluru had put one up. So I asked my young colleague Farheen to look into it
Right.
and write a paper. And the idea was that we look at how many of these zebra crossings are still being used and how many have been added.
Right.
Surprisingly, we found evidence in Delhi, Gurugram, Bangalore of the proposed zebra crossings never coming. Am I correct? Never coming up.
Yeah.
The one that had come up was in Ahmedabad. And we sent somebody there,
Mhm.
click a photograph of how it looks now. Sadly, it had been painted. So, in this, and most of these behavioral experiments or psychological experiments that happen in very contained spaces in the West or even in the East, when it comes to public policy, kind of the wheels come off.
Right.
So, how do we have this constant engagement with citizenry on mental models, beliefs? Because you stress a lot on changing beliefs. But who is going to be doing it? That's one.
Right.
Second, how do we factor in all of this? Because one of the things is that, yes, through the PPP model, we have to have the private sector coming into it. But what if the private sector is not interested in anything which does not get them end of the year shareholder A plus?
Mhm.
Because end of the day, these are
Mhm.
bodies that are fiduciary responsible for their shareholders. So how do we extricate this complicated situation?
Mhm. Mhm. Again, let me unpack it
Right.
in two different sections. the first part, the zebra crossing in Ahmedabad worked and fell into disuse. And this is world over.
This is an
And
illustration
I had gone to Bogota for a conference, and I saw the excellent this BRT that they had put.
Right.
It works. And then, to some surprise to me, I came to Delhi, and of course I know Delhi, I know the routes. Somebody said, we're also making a BRT corridor here. I said, you are? And what's your model? They said, we had gone to Bogota. I said, oh my God, it's not going to work because there's a different structure there. BRT corridor in Delhi, again, I had no knowledge of the details. I said, just won't work because you'll actually worsen the traffic jam. Again, how would people get off the train and how will they get, into the train, etc., etc. In Bogota, they had actually very, very wide boulevards to begin with, so they could actually do it. And the reason is, we always somehow think you can import best practices. Now, the people who did that BRT corridor in India, and one of them was the IIT professor I later found out, all very well-meaning, all very bright people. But they made a very fundamental mistake that what will work in Bogota will work in Delhi. So I think one issue, therefore, we just accept, or one point, is replicability is very, very difficult. You've got to tailor them to the local norms, local culture, and all that. But the flip side of it is that means what? Do we just accept norms as given forever and they're frozen? Of course not. And that is where you have to bring in what are called norm entrepreneurs and start very small. Now, for example, you all have heard about this foot binding custom in China. It was supposed to be nice to have feet which were small and tied, and why people would think it is irrelevant. That's what people believed. In China, they started to move away by essentially choosing what they call norms. Some people in a community, the more sort of educated or whatever, started to say, I am against foot binding, and I am marrying a girl who is not foot bound. And it was amazing how this sort of caught on. In Africa, as you know, and it's still there, it's a sort of a huge challenge, but still much less, is the female genital mutilation. And there's a whole series of work done in many of the countries where, there would be people at the weddings who would say, I am not, cut, as they say. And then it catches on. And sometimes, people say, I agree, I think this is wrong, but if I don't do it, I'll be ostracized. And that's where you need that cluster effect. That's where you need the belief effect. So I think, Amogh, what you are asking is a very relevant and a very complex process. In the past, we ignored it. We assumed it will cancel out. All that we're now saying is you can't ignore it, and the behavioral aspects are real. You and I behave in certain irrational ways, and we've got to build that in. And it'll take time, and we've got to find people who will be willing to change the norms gradually but surely. And we cannot forget the effect of history. For example, they have found, again by studies, trust is such an important element of all of this. I have to trust you. They found that people who had emigrated from the western part of Africa to US and any other places, they generally were less trusting than others. And they said, why is this? And some things were not working because of trust. And then they found that 100 years back, they had come from the area where the slaves were captured. And the slaves were being essentially captured by their friends and their, relatives. They were selling them to the managers. So the whole issue of the social trust had broken down there. And even 100 years after the slavery is long since gone, that DNA, genes impression still remains. So how do you break that? But if you didn't recognize why this lack of trust, and you said, okay, this fellow is not trusting, let's give him one more lecture on the importance of trust, it just won't work. So basically, what institution building is, particularly the informal institution, is a very long, time-consuming process. Each society will have to find its own way because, given its own history, own culture, it'll influence. But they're not immutable. I think that's a point that we make in this book, that norms have changed. For example, if I told you, just think of the country which you think is very punctual. You would think Japan. The trains there actually run to the second. 100 years back, 100 years, not that far back, 150 say, they were actually terribly unpunctual. And as a matter of fact, there's some very interesting stories about somebody went out to say, I'm just going to finish my New Year's greetings. He took off from work, didn't come back for 3 days because he was still saying Happy New Year to his colleagues. But that norm changed when the emperor started to display his watch very prominently, arriving on time. And the moment he arrived on time, the others hadn't. Next time he made sure that, they made sure they arrived. So these norm entrepreneurs can make a difference. And some norms take longer, some, TV shows, there are evidences even in India of TV shows having made a difference. In Africa, there's a lot of evidence of that. So I think the point we're making is that these are real constraints to institutional development. Ignoring them is not the answer, but also transplanting is not an answer. You can't just go to Bogota and learn about BRT and come and do it here. But these things do change, and that's the encouraging part, that, over time, that, they do change. But it's a long process.
So the norm entrepreneurs, as you, and I think this is a fresh addition, a term you've coined. So how do we kind of make this part of the development experience, and how do we scale up this kind of thing?
Again, all your questions are excellent, but you've got many norm entrepreneurs sitting here. Go after the young people to do it. Convince them. Oldies like us will only lecture and then still do the opposite when we leave this room. It's the youngsters who, and this is why we have a whole chapter in the book on peering into the future. And we feel that the demand for good governance will come from the young. First of all, because they're young and they're not bound. And secondly, they're more educated, they're more empowered. I'm sure many of you won't take nonsense as easily as maybe I did, because I said, well, that's the way it's done. So youth is one. The other thing is, in every society, there is a person or persons who sort of somehow takes on that role. And this is why in this book, though we do say leadership is important, but we can't depend on it. It's fortuitous if we are blessed with Nelson Mandela, but we can't wait for that. But look for those norm entrepreneurs in all elements. Don't look for only one leader. Don't look for only one Lee Kuan Yew. See if you can find people all around. And my bet is on the young, and my bet is on education. So if you get the young educated, they will say, what on earth is this foot binding? What does this mean? What is this thing about, you must sort of, bend your head when you see me. Oh, you're an upper caste? Who cares? So as you know, in many places, people, why are you looking at me? Looking at you, why shouldn't I look at you? Oh, because I'm upper caste. Says who? And it's the young who will be able to question such norms. So all of that is also norms. Nobody will now say, you must do this to me when you see me. You must must walk on the other side of the pavement because I'm of a higher caste. But we do it still in many places because that's the norm. Till somebody breaks it, and then another person breaks it, and then people believe that's okay, and then it sort of goes on. I think ultimately this book and everything we're discussing, Amogh, is one of faith and hope. What I'm saying is may or may not happen, but that's the only way history shows changes have happened.
So now we are narrowing down the spectrum and heading towards a touchdown.
Right. Yes.
Before
Yes.
we break for lunch. What is the brightest spot in terms of institutions that you have currently?
There are many, and then there are also not so many. Botswana is one,
Right.
okay, and Japan, Korea. These are all recent. Interestingly, as I said, there was also backsliding. We had Georgia in this book, by the way, and Georgia was doing very well on governance and all that, and suddenly sort of things started to fall apart. Now, if I had time, I would wait for that to work through. I mean, Georgia was known as a horribly corrupt country in the 1990s, made tremendous progress by a decade later. But then internal politics came in the way. So I would say, if I look at the country, each country would probably have pockets of it. Even in India, there are many pockets of very good governance. E-Chopal, for example, that you see, and there are some states who do better than others. Bangalore Metropolitan Development Authority was very, very resistant to change till a good friend of mine, God rest his soul, came up with the idea of scorecard, Samuel Paul. And all that he said was, I'm not going to make any judgment. I'm going to ask the community about what they think of you. And the commissioner first said, who the hell are you? I said, I'm nobody. I'm a citizen. So I'm just asking my colleagues, my neighbors, what do they think of garbage collection? And he published a scorecard. He didn't make any judgment, didn't say this is bad or good. They said, you got 7 out of 10. And the other, community gave you 5 out of 10. And then you start to sort of say, is 5 out of 10 is what I live with? And it changed. And, there are many changes. Now, there's still lots of problems. So I would say you can find pockets of excellence everywhere. Singapore has many examples of things that have worked and worked very well. And of course, people who say, it's a small country. I think, no, that's irrelevant. It's the way they've gone after good governance and enforcement and, how they've sort of nurtured that principle. So it can be done, but we also wanted to come up with a specific conclusion, what to do or how, and unequivocal, and maybe too sort of, optimistically, education and health and empowerment. You educate the young people, they get onto technology, social media, all the downsides accepted, but social media also helps to have the Arab Spring. Now, of course, it was then, completely
Became Arab winter.
Yeah, became Arab winter. But the fact is, it happened because of social media. And that comes from knowledge, that comes from exposure, that comes from thinking of the world as, your oyster. And thinking of, freedom, in a very real sense that, yes, it can be achieved.
So, in all of this, and this is second last question before I open it up to them,
Okay.
but I would really suggest them to have the discussion over lunch, but anyway, Chinese experience. Because it's a yo-yo. They
Right.
build great institution and then go around this
Right.
country.
Right.
For example, just to put it in context, and we are going to be covering it tomorrow, every country has a central bank.
Right.
And central bank does an important thing.
Right.
China also had a central bank, which was doing what central banks had to do. This week they decided, last week to this week, they decided that they don't really want a central bank to make decisions. So they've now got a financial authority on top of a central bank, which makes no sense. So you now have two bodies trying to do the same work that one body has to do. How do we kind of look at it? But they seem to be doing all right.
Again, it depends on how you define doing all right and over what time period. And, you're the history specialist. I'm not. But history tells us, and as I told you earlier,
Right.
that the only way a society progresses, I'm not talking about the zigzag, but if you look at the long arc, is when you get the three players in balance. Now, the state can decide at what level it will control. But the ultimate objective, and China was a great example when Deng Xiaoping did make the reforms and we saw what happened. Now, they decided that no, that freedom was sort of too much in terms of the risk to the politics. And Soviet Union was the opposite example, where they had the glasnost, but they didn't have the perestroika. They had the openness, but they didn't have the restructuring. And then that failed as well. But I think, yes, China's done very well. And by the way, I've said the same thing in China, so not something I'm saying here, and I say something differently there. I think ultimately the balance of the three players needs to be, present, because otherwise, if you have a Tencent or a Alibaba or any other Chinese companies, Huawei, doing so well, and then they find that the rules of the game have suddenly changed or whatever has happened, then their immediate reaction, as you rightly said, is on their bottom line. I mean, that's the way it will have to work. So they will then cut back on investments, they'll cut back on production or whatever. So I think institutions which do not recognize that fundamental reality of the balance will not be as successful. Now, there may be periods of success, no question about it. But in a long run, it won't work. That's my feeling. And according to what we've seen in history, that seems to be the arc.
In China, they have in Japan, they have the Kabuki and New Theatre.
Mm-hmm.
In China, they have the Shuzu opera.
Right.
Shuzu opera is very interesting. It's full of portentous things that may or may not
happen. Yeah.
My last question, because we have reached past, and I have many more to go, but I'm going to stop myself there.
Please.
In a minute, why should somebody read the book?
Well, if you are interested in good governance, and I presume now almost all are, you cannot just stop at why good governance. That's understood. Then you've got to say, okay, if I want to now have good governance, how good governance? I need institutions. Okay, so how do you build institutions? Now, this is a very incomplete answer. I would hope it's not a totally unsatisfactory answer. So I think one would read the book if you want to ask the question and get some answers to what to do, not
and you
why
don't
do
have
it.
to be a specialist in development.
No. We have tried very hard. First of all, as I said, one thing I realized is that one of the biggest problems we economists have created for ourselves, we have thought we ourselves can find the solutions. And what I now realize is you need economists, yes, of course, but you need sociologists, or you need psychologists. And a lot of it is just human psychology. You need a social scientist. You need, a whole host of specializations.
And you need coffee baristas.
And you need coffee baristas to keep you going. So I think if you as an individual, economist, non-economist, sociologist, whatever, political scientist, if you want to know why is understood, but what to do, then this book may be a good beginning. But it won't give you all the answers by any means. So I don't want to sort of raise expectations beyond a point.
But at least it's there, it's available.
Right.
Thank you very much.